Well, today I want to go to the book of Judges again. We were on the book of Judges last week, and I'm going to follow Samson around a little bit. And we talked about the 3 steps last week. The 3 steps that the Israelite people they chose to get them where they are today. And the place where they are today, and we find them in the book of Judges, is a place where God is angry with them. God is angry with them. Whenever God's anger is aroused, He uses the neighboring countries to come in and to punish them, to defeat them, and hold them captive. And then when Israel's people would cry out to God and for help, and God would have mercy on them, and He would raise an individual. He'd raise an individual up to lead them out of this bondage, and they were known at this time as judges. They didn't have a king. They didn't have any kind of centralized leader. At this time they called them judges, and that's where we get the book of Judges. Well, today I want to pick up on chapter 13, and there's already been, we jumped quite a bit. Last week we were right at the beginning of the book. This week we're going to be at chapter 13, and there has already been 7 judges that has been raised up. Now, again, Israel has turned their back on God. They followed false gods, and they were falling into those 3 steps that we talked about last week. They did evil in the sight of the Lord, and since there was no king, what did we say last week? They did what they thought was right in their own eyes. A modern day translation for that, we could call it moral relativism. Doing what you think is right in your own eyes. With moral relativism, there is no absolutes. There's no absolute right, there's no absolute wrong. Everything is relative to the situation that an individual perceives through his own logic. And that's where they're at. That's where they're at right now. And we're going to start with chapter 13, 2 through 5. Now there was a certain man from Zorah of the family of the Dantites, whose name was Manoah. And his wife was barren and had no children. And the angel of the Lord appeared to the woman and said to her, "Indeed now you are barren and have borne no children, but you shall conceive and bear a son. Now therefore please be careful not to drink wine or similar drink, not to eat anything unclean, for behold, you shall conceive and bear a son. And no razor shall come upon his head, for the child shall be a Nazarite to God from the womb. And he shall begin to deliver Israel out of the hands of the Philistines." There were 7 judges before Samson. What was different? What was different about Samson? All the other judges were chosen by God, and God raised these people up. But what was different about Samson? Samson was a Nazarite. Samson was a Nazarite, set apart before he was even born. This angel instructs Samson's mother that she is to also follow these vows of the Nazarite. Nazarites were to abstain from drinking wine, beer, any kind of similar drink. They were to never cut their hair. They were to stay away from anything that was unclean and not to touch anything dead. So, what does the life of a Nazarite represent? Why would God do this? Why would God choose Samson to be a Nazarite? What does the life of a Nazarite represent? It represents vows made to God that should never be changed. Never be changed. The rule of relative does not apply to the Nazarite. You do not change these things. Oh, and that's number one in your sermon notes, and you'll find them in your bulletins. What does the life of a Nazarite represent? It vows to God that should never be altered. His life was to represent absolutes. Absolutes. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter if it's an extremely hot summer and that long hair is hot. Doesn't matter. If God says don't cut your hair, you don't cut your hair. It doesn't matter if every animal in the land has died except for pigs. If God says that pork is unclean, you're now a vegetarian. Because it doesn't matter what the situation is, you do not change. You do not change your vow. It is an absolute. And that's what the Nazarite represents. And this is what they needed. This is what they needed at this time, because they were what? They were doing what they thought were right in their own eyes. Well, Samuel's mother, not Samuel, sorry, Samson's, that's different. Samson's mother told her husband Manoah what had happened. So the word tells us that Manoah, he prayed to God, and he wanted that angel to come back. You know, this angel come and told Samson's mother what was going to happen. So Manoah wanted the angel to come back, and he wanted to ask him, well, what should we do for the boy? What should we do for the boy after he's born? What's his purpose after he is born? And his prayer was answered. We find in Judges 13, 12 through 14, Manoah said, now let your words come to pass. What will the boy's rule of life and his work? What will be the boy's rule of life and his work? So the angel of the Lord said to Manoah, of all that I said to the woman, let her be careful. She may not eat anything that comes from the vine, nor may she drink wine or similar drink, nor eat anything unclean. All that I commanded her, let her observe. Go ahead and play it, Steve. Isn't it interesting that Manoah, he was waiting to know what the purpose of Samson's life would be? What is the purpose of his life? I want to talk to this angel to tell me what do we expect from him? And what does the angel tell him? All the angel tells him is to follow the Nazarite rules. To follow the Nazarite rules. His life is to be a representation that there are absolutes in this world. Interesting, isn't it? We don't know much about Samson's childhood, other than the Bible says the boy grew and the Lord blessed him. Now we pick up the story in chapter 14 when Samuel's, I guess he's a young man. I really don't know how old Samson, I keep saying Samuel, how old Samson is at this time, but I think maybe he's a young man. And we begin to understand the product of doing things that are right in my own eyes. In Judges 14, go ahead, Steve. Judges 14, 1 through 3. Now Samson went down to Timnah and saw a woman in Timnah of the daughters of the Philistines. So he went up and told his father and mother, saying, I have seen a woman in Timnah, the daughters of the Philistines. Now therefore, get her for me as a wife. Then his father and mother said to him, is there no woman among the daughters of your brethren or among all the people that you must go and get a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines? And Samson said to his father, get her for me, for she pleases me well. It's interesting. It's interesting to see that most of Samson's actions are pretty selfish. We'll find that as we follow Samson around. However, God can work through selfishness. I don't think it was ever God's will that Samson to do anything selfish, but God can work through his selfish actions. So, okay. Here we go. We find Samson going down to Timnah, mixing it up with the Philistines. What in the world is Samson down there with the Philistines for? He is God's chosen Nazarite to deliver the Israelite people from the hands of the Philistines. And here he's going down there with them. Is it a mission trip? I don't think so. I don't think it's a mission trip. I don't think he's really trying to convert the Philistines so that they may embrace the true God. Or do you maybe think he's down there because he heard that's where all the beautiful women are? Very possible. These Philistines, Philistines, they do things law-abiding Israelites not allowed to do. Maybe he's down there seeing how the other half lives. Because what do? We're doing what we see what's right in our own eyes, right? So while he's down there, he finds a woman that he would like to make his wife. Now, he's going back home to mom and dad, and he's going to tell them that he wants this gal for his wife, and this is not going to go over very well, is it? So let's remember what we talked about last week. Samson has been raised in an environment that they did what they thought was right in their own eyes, of moral relativism. And we are about to observe the symptoms of this way of thinking, of this way of life. And the very first symptom that we find is the breakdown of parenting skills. Thank you, Steve. The first symptom of moral relativism in chapter 14 is the breakdown of parenting skills. One of the main tools in parenting. What is one of the main tools in parenting? Discipline. I mean, if you don't have discipline, what have you got when you're parenting? One of the main tools in parenting is discipline. If there are no absolutes, then what do we use as a basis for discipline? How do we justify our discipline if there are no absolutes? How do we justify our actions if there are no standards to abide by? Moral relativism has a way of breaking down the accountability of the parent. And if it's easier to be that friend or that teacher to the child rather than the disciplinarian, most people will choose the easier path. I think we find this, and I think we find this in this story. I think we find this in the response by Samson's parents. What did they do? Samson come up from being down with the Philistines where he shouldn't have been in the first place, had no business being down there, found this woman that of all things he wants to make his wife. He goes to his parents and says, I want you to go down there, probably with like a dowry thing or whatever. I want you to go down there and get this woman, this Philistine woman, for my wife. And what is their response? What's their response? They try to reason with him. They try to reason with him. Well, isn't there somebody else? I've worked in the public for years. And believe me, I don't know how many times I've seen this, where there's a brat kid, a product of this, saying, I want. And what does the parents do? Instead of saying no, what does the parents do? Well, we got some at home, or we got, we can, and starts trying to reason with this 5-year-old. If we don't have standards, we can't discipline, and the child suffers. The child is the one that's suffering. So we find Samson's parents trying to reason with his demands. And what good did it do? What good did it do? All he did, Samson just made his demands even stronger. And isn't that what happens when you try to reason with a spoiled kid? Isn't it? That's exactly what happened. Well, guess what happened? There goes mom and dad and their baby boy. They're going down to Timnah to find this girl he wanted for his wife down amongst the Philistines. And the story goes that Samson ran across this lion, and with his incredible strength, he tore the lion in two. He didn't tell his parents about it. And the word tells us later that Samson came and found that carcass again, and found that there was honey inside of this lion's carcass. He took some of it, ate for himself, and he gave his parents some, but he didn't tell his parents where this honey had come from. Well, Samson challenged 30 Philistine men that were part of his wedding party, and we're going to look at that. Judges 14, 12 through 14. Then Samson said to them, "Let me pose a riddle to you. If you could correctly solve and explain it to me within the 7 days of the feast, then I will give you 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothes. But if you cannot explain it to me, then you shall give me 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothes." And they said to him, "Pose your riddle that we may hear it." So he said to them, "Out of the eater came something to eat, and out of the strong came something sweet." Now, for 3 days, they could not explain the riddle. Now, when the Philistines could not figure out the riddle, they approached Samson's wife-to-be, and they said, "Persuade your husband to tell you the answer to this riddle so that you can tell us, because if you don't, we're going to burn your father's household and you to death." Now, I'm sure Samson wasn't expecting the Philistines to act like Philistines, but that's what they were. They were Philistines. And this wasn't an empty threat, by the way. If you want to read the next chapter, you can find out. This wasn't an empty threat. These were people that would do something like this. Now, out of desperation, Samson's bride-to-be finally convinced him to tell him the answer, and so she told them. In Judges 14:18. So the men came to the city and said to him on the 7th day before the sun went down, "What is sweeter than honey?" By the way, this was going to be 7 days. They needed to do this riddle, figure out this riddle within 7 days. And it says on the 7th day before the sun went down. So it was right there at the end of it. "What is sweeter than honey, and what is stronger than a lion?" And he said to them, they give him this answer and said, if you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have solved my riddle. We don't talk like that too much anymore today, do we? Probably a good thing. What was Samson really saying here? He was saying, you guys aren't being fair. You guys cheated because you're not playing the way I wanted you to play. See, relativism teaches us that whenever there are negative consequences for acting upon what we perceive in our own eyes as right, then something unjust and unfair has occurred, and that's number 3. We feel that there's an injustice that has occurred. That whenever I'm acting upon those things that I think is right, and there's negative consequences for it. Do we ever see this in, I don't know, maybe in teenagers sometimes? Teenagers do what, they want those curfews to be a little later, or they want to go to that party, or they want to do these things that they see as right in their own eyes. They don't see anything wrong with them. And then if you do allow those things to happen, and then there are negative consequences that happen because of that, then what's their response? Well, I shouldn't have done it, or is it, well, something unfair has happened here, because it certainly isn't my fault. Something unjust has happened here. It's certainly somebody else's fault. This is what happens. Judges 14, 19 through 20. Let's look at Samson's response. When the Spirit of the Lord came upon him mightily, and he went down to Ashkelon, whatever that word is, and killed 30 of their men, took their apparel, and gave the changes of clothing to those who had explained the riddle. So his anger was aroused, and he went back up to his father's house. And Samson's wife was given to his companion, who had been his best man. There are so many things about this story that is wrong. Number one, was Samson, what was one of the rules for the Nazirite? One of the rules? You know, we always talk about Samson and the cutting the hair thing, but what's one of the rules about the Nazirite that he wasn't supposed to do that we just covered? Touching dead bodies? He just undressed 30 of them, okay? I'm sure there was nothing unclean down there with this wedding party at the Philistines. You know, he was breaking all of these vows of the Nazirite when he was down there. Getting the honey out of the dead, you know, whether the dead carcass, whether it meant dead animals or not, I don't know. I kind of think it did mean dead animals because he didn't tell his parents about it. And so this is just an example, and Brandon, you can come up if you want to. This is just an example of when we live life without absolutes. When we live life according to our own rule, according to the way that we think things should be, and not God's way. And I'm afraid that most of the time that as Christians we think, well, we do things God's way, and we believe in absolutes, but do we? Let me ask you this. Why did the parents of Samson, why did they do what they did? Why did they go ahead and go on down and try to find this woman and make her a wife for Samson and go ahead with the wedding and all of that? Because they were just trying to give their baby boy what he wanted. Right? Are we ever guilty of that? Maybe stretching the rules a little bit? Maybe going outside of what God expects of us to, I don't know, give those kiddos what they want, what they're expecting. What was accomplished in chapter 14? Think about it a minute. At the beginning of chapter 14, Samson wanted a bride. He wanted a bride. He got his parents together and he said, go down and get me that bride. And all of this stuff happened in chapter 14. All of this stuff. And then at the end of 14, where was he? He was still single and he's going back to mom and dad. Nothing changed. Nothing changed. No status changed in chapter 14. A lot happened. And it's just, to me, when we think about it, this reflects our life so many times. Whenever we act upon what we want, and so much can happen. So much hardship can happen. We can hurt so many people. So much can happen, and nothing can actually. The end result is still the same. Because we're acting on our own feelings. We're acting on what we want. What was Samson really wanting? What was Samson really guilty of? He was wanting companionship. He was wanting companionship. He was wanting a bride. He was also trying to impress his peers with this riddle. Do we ever break God's absolutes? Sometimes just because we want companionship. Maybe there's things we do that will stretch the rules a little bit just because we want companionship. Maybe we'll stretch the rules a little bit because we're trying to impress somebody else. You know, sometimes we read this story about Samson and we think, man, that's those other guys that act that way, not us. I don't know. Sometimes we need to take a good look at ourselves. Maybe we're a little more like Samson than what we thought. You know, really, when you think about the Nazarite, aren't all followers of Jesus Christ in a way kind of like a Nazarite? Shouldn't we hold up certain lifestyle, certain vows to God? We should represent that lifestyle that is pure and holy, and well, it's not much different, do we? Well, Brandon's going to play this morning, and you're always welcome to come to the altar and pray about these things, and come if you will.